Hello and welcome to today's discussion on Towards Statehood or the Statehood Era Part 2. In today's lecture, we'll talk about the population transformation that occurred in Washington, how Washington ended up with hundreds of thousands of residents, enabling it to apply for statehood. That story is intertwined with the economic development of the United States, specifically industrialization and the development of railroads. So that will all be in today's conversation. Once again, I must apologize. I'm still under the weather, so you'll hear my nose is still a little bit congested, and you'll occasionally hear me cough. I'll try and keep it to a minimum as much as I have control over these things, but I once again just want to apologize to you for that. All right. So, I want to begin today's lecture with two basic numbers. Okay? Two basic numbers. Number one is in 1870, Washington had a population of 23,955 people. Remember, we have these numbers because under the Constitution, the United States is required to take a census every 10 years. and the census is used for all sorts of reasons today, but in the 19th century, it's primarily for allocating representation in the House of Representatives, as required under the Constitution. So that's why we have these numbers. Additionally, it's important for the federal government to know the um, population of the territories to know when it's appropriate for them to apply for statehood. Now, it's important to remember that by 1870, Oregon's already a state. Oregon had become a state in the late 1850s. And so Oregon's already a state. By 1870, Washington territory itself has about 23,955 people. It is not enough for statehood. It is not enough for statehood. That doesn't mean that residents of Washington didn't want statehood. They desperately do. They'll spend the 1870s and 80s begging Congress to make exceptions for them so that they can apply for statehood. As I mentioned as an aside in a previous lecture, and I'll just reemphasize again, Washington remained a territory for longer than most states in the history of the United States. It certainly isn't the longest. There were other states in the West, or places like Hawaii and Alaska, that had a longer record for being territories before being authorized to move towards statehood. Um, but Washington has a relatively long journey compared to the rest of the existing American states. So residents of Washington wanted statehood because that brought with them representation in the federal government and direct control over their state governments and local governments in a more profound way. But they didn't have the population, and Congress wasn't going to authorize it. Now, by 1889, which is the year Washington becomes a state, Washington does have it. It has 357,232 people. That's enough to apply for statehood. What is the reason? Why in 19 years did the population exponentially grow like this? Well, it doesn't have anything to do with Washington itself. It has to do with the railroads. And the railroads themselves has to do with industrialization. So, pardon me, we need to have a conversation about industrialization. What is it? Where is it happening? Why is it having any impact on Washington Territory and later the state of Washington? So, in the late 19th century, the east parts of the United States, particularly the eastern United States and the Great Lakes area, so the eastern United States and the Great Lakes area, are undergoing industrialization. They are undergoing industrialization. They are not the first places on the planet to do that. Great Britain was the world's first industrialized nation. Then it spread to places in Europe, but also to the northeastern United States. But by the 1850s, but especially the 60s, 70s, and 80s, particularly the period 1860 to 1900, the United States undergoes a rapid process of industrialization, mostly, as I said earlier, in the northeastern United States and around the Great Lakes. And that is going to turn the United States into not just an industrialized nation, but an economic superpower. We're going to become one of the world's largest economies. And that will have profound consequences for the United States, but also for places like Washington and their relationship to the rest of the world. We will explore that in subsequent lectures and units in this course. But let's talk about what industrialization is so that we all kind of understand it. Industrialization is just a transformation in the production of goods. It's a transformation in what we call manufacturing. The word manufacturing actually reflects how goods were originally made. And by goods, I mean clothing or shoes or anything made of metal or machines, or take your pick. Anything that was ever made in world history was made by hand. And that's actually what the word manufacture means. The word manufacture is a compound Latin word. It's made up of two Latin words. Manu, which comes from the Latin word manus, which is hand, and facture comes from factus or factus, which is something that's been made. So something that's made by hand is what manufacturing means. And that reflects the fact that before industrialization, before the Industrial Revolution, everything that we ever had in the world was made by hand, made by a craftsman. Well, industrialization changed that process. Suddenly, goods were made by machines. Textiles, which is anything woven, they were made by machines. So shirts and blankets and linens, all made by machines. Shoes, made by machines. Things made of metal, made by machines. And machines result in what's called mass production, because machines can make things quicker and more efficiently, exponentially so, than people and craftsmen making things by hand. So what we have is what's called the mechanization of the manufacturing process. Machines are making things and they're able to mass produce. Okay? They're able to mass produce. Industrialization transforms an economy. Now, in order to have industrialization, you kind of need three basic things. You need labor, so you need workers to work in a place called a factory, which is where the machines are that make goods now. See, the machines are making the goods, but the machines still need to be maintained. They need to be fed. They need the output or the finished product taken off or out of the machine. They need to be fueled, they need to be repaired, and so on and so forth by humans. So what happens is that industrialization creates new jobs. They're just different jobs. Now, that's all I'm going to say about that for right now. If you want to explore industrialization further, you can take a U.S. History 2 class that explores U.S. history since the Civil War, or you can take a modern world history or a modern Western civilizations class where you'll talk more about industrialization in depth. For now, I just want you to be aware that industrialization requires a lot of workers. You need workers to maintain the factories. That is what's causing massive immigration to the United States in the late 19th century, is American factories' need for laborers. And we don't have enough workers in this country, and so they're recruiting them from all over the world. So you need labor. You also need raw materials and resources, right? You need the raw materials that are going to go into the factory to become finished goods, right? Because that's what happens. You take a raw material, you take it to the factory, it's pumped in the machine and becomes a finished good. It's not quite that simple, but that's the basic idea. You also need resources, right? If you're going to have these cities where the factories are, and as I said, this is largely taking place in the northeastern United States and the Great Lakes area. If you're going to have these urban centers where people are moving to work in the factories because that's where the jobs are, well, these people need food. They need certain resources in order to make their lives possible, in addition to the factories needing the raw materials to create finished goods. And so you need raw materials to make it to the factory, and you need resources to feed and take care of and supply the urban centers where these factories are located. And then you need markets. Industrialization is about mass production. It's no good mass producing things if you don't have people to buy it. Now, America will need to satisfy two kinds of markets. Markets domestically, so domestic markets, markets within the country. And then externally, export markets, send goods to other places in the world, foreign markets, export markets. So labor, raw materials and resources, and markets. That's what you need for industrialization. The United States either has these things or the ability to acquire these things. Okay? The United States either has these things or the ability to acquire these things. So it has locations useful for doing industrialization. It has urban centers back east that then are the basis for further immigration. It has many of the raw materials, the minerals, the agricultural products, the resources that are needed to either feed the factories or feed the people. It also has a very large population. The United States has a very large population, so it has domestic markets, and also it has lots of ports to get markets to the rest of the world. The problem is it doesn't have the infrastructure for much of this. I'll say it again. The United States has the components necessary for industrialization, but it doesn't have the infrastructure necessary to effectively industrialize the economy as business leaders and political leaders want to do so. And that's where the railroads come in, because the railroads are the key in two areas of the industrial process. On the one hand, they're how you can get raw materials and natural resources to the industrial cities. How are you going to get cotton to the mills of the Northeast? Railroads. You can use ships, but railroads are pretty effective. How are you going to get iron ore to be transformed into steel? Railroads. How are you going to get the coal to power these factories? Because that's what's happening is coal-fired power plants. Railroads. Incidentally, the coal is also going to power the railroad. How are you going to get beef and canned fish and lumber products from the American West, like Washington Territory, to these cities? Railroads. And when the factories need to export their finished goods, how are you going to get them to American markets? Railroads. How are you going to get them to the ports where they can get to overseas foreign markets? Railroads. Railroads are the key here, and they're driven by the industrial economy's need for better infrastructure to meet the demand caused by industrialization. And Washington Territory is going to benefit from this. Railroads are like the very image of the taming of the West, if you will, of the development of the West. And they are the key to the economic and population transformation of Washington. So let's begin that story. It was understood that railroad technology would be key to the development of the West from the very start of Manifest Destiny. From the very start of Manifest Destiny, after in 1845 and beyond. So from the 1840s on, it was very clear that railroads were going to play a key role in the development of the West. Let me explain why. There were already railroads in the eastern United States in the 1840s. In fact, railroad technology was well developed in places like Great Britain, where by 1850 they had about 6,000 miles on the island of Great Britain alone. I just want you to think about that. The island of Great Britain alone is basically the size of the Pacific Northwest. Actually, the Pacific Northwest itself is bigger than that, but the Great Britain fits comfortably within the Pacific Northwest. And there's 6,000 miles of rail track in Great Britain because they pioneered railroad technology and railroad techniques. And so it was already well known what railroads could do for industry and economic and political and military development. And there were already some railroads in the eastern United States. So it was well known that railroads were going to play a key back west as westward expansion began. And if you recall, when Isaac Stevens comes out here as governor of the first territorial governor of the state of Washington, he's also the first superintendent of Indian Affairs. As he comes out here, right, and serves that purpose, he is also charged not just with negotiating treaties and reservations, but also surveying for railroads. And this is in the 1850s. Now, keep in mind, there's been no chartering of a transcontinental railroad, but Isaac Stevens has already been ordered by the federal government to plan for those things. So even in the 1840s and 50s, they knew transcontinental railroads were going to be the key. But transcontinental railroads were politically contentious in the 1850s, primarily because they got caught up in the sectional crisis of the 1850s, which is the buildup to the Civil War. I mean, almost every issue became a political battleground in the 1850s. So transcontinental railroads were like that. There was a desire to for the federal government to charter them, and by charter, what is meant by that is the federal government somehow not just authorizing a business to create a transcontinental railroad, but giving the business assistance and incentives for doing so. Right? And so there was already a desire for the federal government to help give this infrastructure plan a boost, but it just got caught up in the politics leading to the Civil War. During the Civil War, that's when Congress begins to do this. So in 1862, Congress does the Railroad Act, which is the chartering of the first transcontinental railroad. In 1864, there's the Railway Act, which charters a second transcontinental railroad. Now, the first transcontinental railroad act, pardon me, the first transcontinental railroad to start construction that was chartered was what's called the Central Pacific Railroad. And what the Central Pacific Railroad did is it began building from California, like Sacramento, working its way east. And that is a very difficult and demanding environment. It required a lot of dangerous bridge work through the mountains, the Sierras and the Rockies. It also required a lot of dangerous tunnel work through those mountains. It was a very dangerous job. And one of the major labor sources for it was Chinese immigrant labor. And the reason for that is that Chinese immigrant labor was considered to be cheap and disposable, and their lives weren't valued in the same way as other kinds of labor. It was incredibly racist and dehumanizing. But that's a lot of the racist people who built this railroad, they exploited and used Chinese labor for those means, for those reasons. This railroad was progressing very slowly because of the technological challenges. The second railroad chartered was the Union Pacific, which basically began in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and began working across the Great Plains west. Now, originally, these were supposed to be two different railroads. They were chartered by the United States government, which means the United States government basically helped them with the building of the railroad. And the way the United States government helped them is they basically gave them the land. They said, here's you look at the surveys, you tell us the path of the railroad, and then we'll give you the land. Right? Because of the treaty and reservation system, the land had been cleared. And so they cleared the land, and now they were giving the land to a private company to build these railroads. I just want you to keep in mind, these railroads, the owners of these railroads are going to become some of the richest people in American history. And they didn't have to buy the land that the railroads were on. It was given to them by the federal government because the federal government had confiscated it from indigenous peoples. Now, the Union Pacific had a much less challenging, geographic environment to build this in. They were building across largely flat land until they got to the Rocky Mountains. So they moved a little bit quicker. But what happened is the railroads still weren't moving quick enough for the United States government. So what the United States government basically did is they compelled these two railroads to join together. They were originally supposed to be separate railroads, but the United States government looked and said, we won't have a transcontinental railroad for years if we don't force them to join together, because the Union Pacific's been moving fast, but now they're going to hit the Rockies and the Sierras, so they're going to way slow down building this. And even though the Central Pacific is through most of the mountains, they've still got a couple mountains to go. Then they got to build across the plains, and it's just going to be so long that we just want to compel them to join together. So we get a transcontinental railroad, which is what the United States government did. They compelled them to join their railroads together, which they began to work towards that. And in 1869, they came together at a place called Promontory Point, Utah. You can see the photo here of the two railroads meeting. And in 1869, the first transcontinental railroad in the United States is finished. The United States has built the largest railroad in the world. It is a wonder of the world, and it is now joining other railroad networks that basically connects the United States coast to coast. Immediately, the Oregon Trail is effectively discontinued. That doesn't mean people don't still move across it, but there's no reason to now, because why take a journey that takes between 120 and 130 days with all the risk and all the physical difficulty when you can have your goods shipped on the railroad and buy passenger fare and get across the United States in a matter of a couple weeks? It's just, there's no reason to do the Oregon Trail anymore. Now, the main beneficiary in the West of the railroad was California, because originally what happened was this thing just went to Sacramento and then they built a spur line to San Francisco. So California is the major beneficiary of this. But Washington benefits because what happens is that you can get on a ship in San Francisco Bay and then go up to the Puget Sound. So Washington will benefit from this. It's the major reason you see population increase so much by 1870. A lot of that growth happened in that 1 year between 1869 and 1870. Eventually, spur lines will be built north from San Francisco to get to Oregon and Washington. But what Washington residents really want is a transcontinental railroad that reaches the Pacific Northwest, preferably Washington, but the Pacific Northwest. Now, before the Transcontinental Railroad reached Washington, regional railroad and transportation companies were developing here. And it's important that you're aware of these because they're going to play a role a little bit later on. So regional rail lines and transportation systems were developing. So in 1860, we had something called the Oregon Steam Navigation Company that was founded. It mainly was a steamship, those big old like paddle ships that are famous on the Mississippi River. Well, we had them on the Columbia as well. So this was really a steam company that moved up and down the Columbia. But back then, there were massive rapids on the Columbia, like at Celilo Falls, which is where the Dalles Dam is, or Cascade Locks. Those kinds of things, you couldn't navigate up them. There were waterfalls or rapids. And so what you had is steamships that operated between those two areas. And then goods and people were ferried across on railroads. They were ported from place to bypass the rapids and then get back on the ship. And so railroads were part of the steamships for goods and people that needed to get further up the Columbia. So small railroads along the river were owned to portage around rapids and waterfalls. Now, this company existed until 1879 when it was purchased by a guy named Henry Villard. We'll talk about Henry Villard in just a moment. There was another railroad in Washington called the Walla Walla and Columbia River Railroad, which operated rail service in western Idaho, Walla Walla, and around the Columbia River. It was mostly about carrying gold from the Lewiston mines to Walla Walla and from Walla Walla to the Snake and Columbia Rivers, where you could then move downstream. But it also carried agricultural products. So it was a major economic part of the economic infrastructure here. Henry Villard purchased this in 1880 as well. So we already have some small regional railroads and steamship networks in the 1860s and 70s in Washington, ultimately purchased by this man named Henry Villard. And Henry Villard is going to play a key role in this story. Excuse me. So Henry Villard was an immigrant to the United States. And he became really involved in and interested in railroads and transportation as a business model. In 1864, the Northern Pacific Railroad was chartered under the Railway Act. And the charter was given to a guy named J. Cook. So this Northern Pacific Railroad was supposed to create a transcontinental road across the northern United States, roughly from like St. Paul, Minnesota, to Seattle, Tacoma, Everett, to the Puget Sound. That's what it was supposed to be. And J. Cook had the charter to do this, and therefore was given the lands to be able to do part of this. And J. Cook started building this railroad. In 1873, there's an economic depression in the United States. It's often called the Panic of 1873, but as I mentioned, when you in the 19th and early 20th century, you see the word panic for Panic of 1837, Panic of 1873, Panic of 1893. They're economic depressions. It's what they are. They're economic downturns. And so in 1873, with the Northern Pacific Railroad partially built, Jay Cook's company goes bankrupt. Now, Henry Villard, this immigrant interested in railroads and transportation, decided that this was too good of an opportunity to pass up. And so what happens is he finds investors and he begins to buy up regional railroads. And then he buys up what the what the Northern Pacific Railroad has already built. And so what he eventually does is he has all these regional railroad networks in the northern United States he's purchased. And he's purchased the Northern Pacific Railroad lines from the bankrupt Jay Cook's bankrupt company. So now he owns like all these railroads. So all he begins to do is consolidate and link them together, which means that the original Northern Pacific path that Jay Cook had envisioned from St. Paul, Minnesota to the Puget Sound is not going to happen. It's not going to happen because Henry Villard doesn't want to spend the money to build the railroad primarily across northern Idaho and central Washington across the Cascades. He doesn't want to do that because he's bought all these regional railroads. He wants to link them up. Keep in mind, he's bought all these railroads along the Columbia River. So what happens is the Northern Pacific Railroad was originally under Jay Cook's vision supposed to end in the Puget Sound. Instead, what happens is he links what's been built, expands it, and connects it to the railroads he owns along the Columbia River. And so, in 1881, he purchased the Northern Pacific Railroad, linked it together with his railroads in the Pacific Northwest, and the Northern Pacific Railroad was born. It terminated in Portland. So you can see the path here. It basically runs from St. Paul, Minnesota, across the Northern Plains, Montana, and then it goes across central Idaho along the Columbia River to Portland. Now later, spur lines were built to go through Yakima, through central Washington, from Portland to Seattle. They were originally built, or they were later built, but the original line was from St. Paul to Portland, Oregon. But Portland, Oregon is very close to Washington Territory. It's in the Pacific Northwest. That meant railroads suddenly made the journey to Washington possible in a couple of weeks. It meant a cheaper journey west. It also meant more markets for the natural resources produced in Washington State. And that meant inevitably large population growth. And the numbers here speak to this impact of the railroads. 1811, around 11,000 people. 1860, around 11,000 people. 1870, 23,955. It's a big growth. 1880, 73,116. The 1880 number is just a decade of a transcontinental railroad that basically goes to California. And we've already seen large growth. 9 years later, with the Northern Pacific Railroad completed in 1883, and that's important. It's completed in 1883. It's open to the public in 1883. Well, 6 years later, 357,239 people. It is an enormous jump. An enormous jump. This population will be enough for statehood. We'll talk about statehood specifically in a subsequent lecture. But I want to talk a little bit about the population growth and the diversity of it and the immigrants who are here in a broad sense. So this is just previewing it. For the rest of this lecture, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about immigrants, where they're coming from, and the attitudes they impacted, how they were received. In the next lecture, we'll talk about immigration overall in the United States, so you get a sense of the different peoples who are coming to the United States as a whole, because that will then help you understand the diversity of populations that end up in Washington. And then in a lecture after that, we'll talk specifically about the Chinese immigrant experience in the American West, of which Washington is a part of, because that will help you frame the larger narratives. So this is an introduction to a conversation we'll explore a lot more in the next two lectures. I'm just setting it up here. It's a period of intense immigration in the United States. In fact, it's the largest period of immigration in American history, right? This period, 1865 to 1920. And it gets more intense after 1880, but 1865 to 1920 is the largest period of immigration in American history, right? And Washington participates in this because as Washington's economy grows, it is attracting immigrants who landed in other places, San Francisco or New York, to ultimately come out here. That means Washington will have an enormously diverse population. In fact, 1/4 of all residents in Washington in 1889 are either foreign born or the children of foreign born, the first generation of American citizens. I just want you to think about that. 1/4 of the entire population out here is either foreign born or the children of foreign born. I think about what that means for the culture of Washington, for society in Washington, for language in Washington, for experiences in Washington, for religious worship in Washington, for a whole host of things in Washington. If 1/4 of your population is foreign born or the children of foreign born. Now, many of these groups came from Scandinavia. Scandinavian groups tended to settle in the Puget Sound, Scandinavia being Sweden, Norway, Denmark. And people from Scandinavia tended to settle in the Puget Sound and work in the timber industry. But you also get large groups from Eastern Europe. In fact, Washington will have a large population of Jews fleeing pogroms in Russia that settle here. You also get people settling from Greece and Italy, so from the Mediterranean. And actually, Washington, in addition, most of these people who migrate from Greece and Italy, so Greek Americans and Italian Americans, they're mostly Christians. But there will be a large Sephardic community, Sephardic Jewish community in Washington State as well, which is pretty unique because there aren't a lot of Sephardic Jewish communities in the United States as a whole. Most Jewish communities are called Ashkenazic. Ashkenazic are Jewish peoples from Central and Eastern Europe. And Sephardic Jews are Jews from originally from the Iberian Peninsula, but then due to history, they just migrated to other parts of the Mediterranean. And so Sephardic Jewish communities are not terribly common in the United States. Overwhelmingly, the Jewish population here is of Ashkenazic descent from Central and Eastern Europe. But Washington State will have a large Sephardic Jewish community here. And that's pretty interesting and unique in the United States. We will also have a large Irish population because Irish immigration has been a staple in the United States since the 1840s and will continue to be so. But with the coming of the transcontinental railroads, the conclusion of the transcontinental railroads, and the growth of the canning and logging industries, you will get a large Chinese population, a large Chinese American population. And we'll talk more about that in a subsequent lecture, okay? But it's a very, very, very diverse population. Excuse me. And with that diverse population, we need to talk about racial and ethnic attitudes in the United States that will determine the reception of immigrants in the United States, including in Washington Territory and later Washington State. So we're going to talk about social Darwinism and WASP in just a moment, but I want to just talk to you briefly about identity concepts within the United States as a whole. So in the United States, in general, the dominant culture in the United States was constructed around a definition and a concept of whiteness, of being white. Now, that notion of whiteness, that concept of whiteness, wasn't just a social or cultural construct. It wasn't just something that internal attitudes that people held. It actually had been embedded in our immigration law, and from there into our law as a whole in this country. If you don't believe me, simply look at slavery, and then after slavery, the post-slavery Reconstruction era. Look at Jim Crow. Jim Crow, right? Jim Crow laws were the discriminatory laws against black people in the South. If you're going to target people for being black, then you have to have a definition of what constitutes black and what constitutes not black or white and whiteness. If you're going to have a concept of who is bound to a reservation under the terms of treaties, then you have to have a definition of what constitutes an Indian and what constitutes white American. And by the way, this matters because we'll talk about this in another lecture, right? We'll talk about this in another lecture because it's really important. Because later on in this unit, we're going to talk about some changes in American Indian policy that have tremendous impact on people within the state of Washington. But one thing you have to understand is to be legally constructed as an indigenous person in the 1870s and 1880s meant that you were given fewer rights and lesser rights. In fact, it wasn't until 1879 that Native peoples were considered human beings under the law. Say it again, it wasn't until 1879 that Native peoples were considered human beings under the law. Think about that. Think about that. And all that's predicated on indigenous peoples being understood as other, as not white, and their rights being lesser than or defined in a certain way compared to the white populations. And in fact, American immigration, the very first laws in the United States covering immigration, dating back to the 1790s, talked about immigration being allowable for quote-unquote white Europeans, but no one else. Well, that invited then definitions of whiteness. This wasn't just a social or cultural construct. It wasn't just looking at someone's skin tone and determining what class they should fall into, racially speaking, ethnically speaking. American law, aspects of the Constitution as it was understood in the 18th and 19th centuries, had concepts of whiteness and what it meant to be not white embedded into all aspects of the law and our political processes. And this is just a taste of that. I'm not even getting into any kind of depth here. It's just a brief kind of primer of what this meant. And the reason I'm introducing this now is that whiteness was an important way that society thought about itself and in which the law was constructed. And inevitably that means anyone who immigrates to this country is going to find a reception on the basis of that social and legal construct that is whiteness and being white. Because so many of your political and so many of your legal rights are determined by how you're understood in that construct. So, one thing you need to be aware of, right, is the dominant construct of whiteness socially, culturally, and legally in the 19th century is defined by the term WASP. WASP. And WASP is an acronym. It stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Now, Anglo-Saxon is just a fancy way of saying English. So white people of English ancestry who are Protestant. That was dominant culture. They were the socio-economic political elites of this country. They were the elite families in this country who controlled the important businesses and important political positions. But it was also embedded into the law that these people had privileges and rights that others did not, depending on where you were in the country and depending on what aspect of the law you're talking about. Now, that concept of WASP was often extended to groups that were similar to, or were understood to be similar to the English, like the Dutch or the people from Scandinavia or people from Germany, but not Jews from Germany, Christian populations. Those people were kind of grandfathered into whiteness and the WASP construct, which means if you fit that kind of category of being white of Northern European descent and were Protestant, you faced less discrimination, fewer social barriers than other peoples in this country. Some groups, like Italians or Greeks or people from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, or people from Eastern Europe, or people from Ireland, they weren't constructed as quote unquote white. In some cases, like say the in some cases, like say the peoples of the Mediterranean, peoples of the Mediterranean were considered from Nordic or Northern European stock, and therefore they weren't white. It also didn't help that they were Christians, but they were either Catholics in the case of people from Spain and Portugal and Italy, or Orthodox Christians in the case of Greece. Similarly true of people from Eastern Europe, people from like today, which would be Czech Republic, the Baltic states, Slovakia, the Balkans like Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, Serbia, Hungary, or even Russia, right? They weren't considered white either. But they were often considered kind of white adjacent, but not classically white because they weren't WASP. The Irish were often discriminated against because of their Catholicism. So if you were from an area of Ireland in which you were Protestant, you were largely lumped into WASP. You were given kind of a British veneer. But if you were from the Catholic parts of Ireland, remember Ireland's a part of the British Empire at this time, so it's not independent. If you're from Catholic Ireland, which is where the vast majority of the immigrants to the United States from Ireland were from Catholic Ireland, well, then you face discrimination. But the discrimination faced by these Southern and Eastern European groups and the Irish was a lot less than the discrimination faced by Jewish groups. Jews largely came from Eastern Europe, although I did mention in Washington we do get a Sephardic community or Mediterranean Jewish community, but mostly they were from Eastern Europe. And Jews faced enormous discrimination and persecution in the 19th century and 20th century America. That doesn't mean Jews couldn't overcome that persecution. In some cases they did. Like for instance, in Seattle, one of the earliest mayors of Seattle was a guy named Bailey Gatzert, and he was Jewish. He's one of the first Jewish mayors in American mayors of Jewish descent in the entire United States. But by and large, Jews faced enormous discrimination. Immigrants from Ireland or even the Mediterranean could often pass as WASP if they assimilated enough to American culture. They probably could pass as WASP. But Jews often found assimilation difficult because of their cultural and religious heritage. No matter how much they tried, they were still considered Jews, and therefore their ability to assimilate to dominant culture, to WASP culture, was always limited. But treated even worse were immigrants from Asia. And at this time, the only immigrants from Asia were Chinese immigrants. Chinese immigrants were treated the worst. They were never going to pass as WASP. And they were treated to enormous racist and racial discrimination, as you'll learn in subsequent lectures, both at a local level, but also from a national policy level. So, WASP is a really important concept. Another really important concept is something called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism. Now, as the name implies, as the term implies, it draws from Darwinian ideas about evolution and biology, but it is a perversion of them. In fact, Charles Darwin himself hated the application of his ideas in this way. It didn't stop the people from doing this with his ideas, and it took on a life of his own. And social Darwinism is really important for understanding a lot of what happens in American political and social history in the 19th and early 20th century. So, as you might be aware of, in 1859, Charles Darwin published a revolutionary book in the field of science called On the Origin of Species. Now, On the Origin of Species was not the first book to postulate evolution. People often get that wrong. They think Darwin invented evolution. That's not true at all. Darwin didn't invent evolution. Evolution had been talked about going back to the 1700s. What Darwin did was he had an explanation for it, a mechanism for how evolution occurs. No one had ever been able to do that in a scientifically satisfactory kind of way. Darwin did, and he called it natural selection. And what Darwin argued was, within a species of animals, those members of a species that have the physical or mental or whatever, the genetic traits necessary to survive, they will survive and therefore are more likely to produce offspring. And their offspring will carry their genetic traits that allow them to survive. And if those traits over thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of years, if those traits are the traits that are necessary for survival, they'll keep getting selected. And as they get selected, they will change a species. That's what Darwin effectively argued on the origin of species with his idea of natural selection. However, to the masses, now Darwin never actually uttered this phrase, but the phrase that gets associated with Darwin is survival of the fittest. That's how society as a whole crudely broke down his idea. Now, Darwin was just talking about animals in nature, plants in nature. But what happened is that people began to apply his ideas to humans themselves, and not human evolution, but modern day human cultures. And what they basically argued is that some humans are superior to others and therefore are surviving. And those that don't have those superior traits either have to adapt or die off. And these individuals who are arguing for this idea often equated race with species. And they said the white race is a species. Anyone who is not white belongs to a different species. Now, to be clear, not only is this incredibly racist, it's also scientifically false, categorically false. It's not science. But it didn't stop them from applying this idea in this way. And what happens is this gets used to justify imperialism. White people are superior to indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have to adapt or die off. White Europeans and Americans are superior to people from Asia or Africa. Therefore, they should colonize and take their resources. They should adapt or they won't survive. Rich people are superior to poor people. And therefore, poor people either need to work harder or they die off. This is applied to justify why rich white people control politics and the economy and why everyone else doesn't. So social Darwinism is being used to justify racism, imperialism, economic inequality, the whole host of things. Social Darwinism will lead to an idea called eugenics, because social Darwinism basically says that some people, some racial groups have superior traits. Well, eugenics says is we should be engineering society and elevating those we quote unquote consider desirable and eliminating those we don't consider desirable. If social Darwinism and eugenics sounds a lot like what the Nazis did, it's because it is. But I want you to understand is these ideas were widely discussed and accepted by people in Europe and the United States, and they became the basis for our laws or for political policies. And of course, social Darwinism and eugenics began to be used to rationalize WASP, right? The white Northern Europeans. They were the quote unquote desirable peoples. Everyone else was less desirable. This is incredibly racist. I cannot convey to you enough how racist this is. How these ideas can lead not just to racist policies and laws, but to rationalize ethnic cleansing and genocide. These ideas played a role in the treatment of indigenous peoples out west during the wars we've been talking about, but also in what comes next. It's used to rationalize all sorts of atrocities, all sorts of discrimination, all sorts of racism, all sorts of inequality. And these ideas will impact WASP, social Darwinism, eugenics will impact how immigrants are treated in Washington Territory and later Washington State in the late 19th century all the way through the 20th century. All right. I thank you for listening. In the next lecture, we'll talk broadly about immigration in America. After that, we'll talk broadly about the Chinese immigrant experience in the West before coming back to talk about Washington becoming a state. I thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.